the day exchange rates became weapons. It did not begin with soldiers or sanctions. It began with a number changing on a board, a small adjustment, barely noticed by the public, that quietly transformed money into an instrument of pressure. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the damage was already unfolding across borders. To understand why exchange rates became weapons, we must return to a moment when Europe's economies were tightly bound yet deeply mistrustful. Trade-linked rivals, debt-connected allies. Currencies moved constantly, reflecting confidence, fear, and speculation. Governments spoke of cooperation, but each watched the others closely, aware that imbalance could become advantage. Money had become the battlefield no one wanted to admit existed. The first reveal appears inside central banking circles. Policymakers realized that adjusting interest rates or reserves no longer produced predictable results. Markets reacted faster than legislation. Capital crossed borders in seconds. But one lever remained powerful and subtle: exchange rates. A currency could be weakened without firing a shot. A rival's exports could be crippled overnight. Debt burdens could be made heavier with a single coordinated move. The second beat followed when adjustments stopped being defensive. What began as protection became strategy. States timed currency moves to coincide with trade negotiations, elections, and diplomatic disputes. A sudden devaluation could erase years of industrial planning. An unexpected appreciation could choke employment. Official statements denied intent, framing shifts as technical necessity. But patterns emerged too precise to ignore. Industries felt the impact immediately. Manufacturers lost contracts. Importers faced soaring costs. Workers saw wages shrink in real terms without a single law being passed. The battlefield was invisible, but the casualties were not. Exchange rates no longer describe reality. They shaped it, and in that moment, Europe crossed a line it could not easily step back from. Money had stopped being a mirror of power. It had become power itself. The transformation accelerated as governments recognized how little accountability accompanied these moves. Exchange rates shifted through committees and algorithms, far from public debate. No vote recorded the consequences. No law explained the losses. When questioned, officials spoke in abstractions: market signals, inflation targets, technical alignment. Responsibility dissolved into procedure. As the reveal deepened, patterns hardened. Certain currencies weakened whenever trade talks stalled. Others strengthened ahead of key negotiations. Export-heavy regions found themselves squeezed just as they gained leverage. Debt-heavy states watched their obligations swell without borrowing a single coin. What looked like coincidence became choreography. The conflict surfaced when industries began comparing notes across borders. Manufacturers realized their rivals benefited from precisely timed adjustments. Farmers saw subsidies erased by unfavorable rates. Airlines, shipping firms, and energy providers faced volatility that no hedge could fully absorb. The sense of unfairness grew sharper because no rule had been broken, only exploited. Governments denied weaponization, but internal documents told another story. Leaked briefings described exchange policy as a tool of influence, a way to apply pressure without triggering retaliation. It was cleaner than sanctions, quieter than tariffs, and far harder to trace back to intent. Numbers changed, effects followed, accountability vanished. The buildup intensified as states began responding in kind. One adjustment prompted another. Retaliation arrived not through words, but through counter-movements measured in decimals. Markets grew nervous, sensing escalation without a framework to contain it. Volatility spiked. Trust thinned. Allies questioned whether cooperation still existed beneath the surface. Ordinary people felt the impact in fragments. Prices rose without explanation. Travel became unpredictable. Savings lost value unevenly. Life grew more expensive not because resources vanished, but because ratios shifted. The invisible war had entered daily existence. By now, the realization spread among policymakers and citizens alike. Exchange rates were no longer passive reflections of trade and confidence. They were active instruments, capable of rewarding friends, punishing rivals, and reshaping economies in silence. And once money becomes a weapon, restraint becomes optional. The only question left was whether Europe could survive a battlefield no one could see. The escalation reached a dangerous threshold when coordination replaced coincidence. States began aligning exchange moves with allies, creating blocks defined not by treaties, but by synchronized currency shifts. A weaker rate here, a stronger one there, and suddenly entire supply chains tilted. Companies found themselves trapped between systems pulling in opposite directions, forced to choose sides they never intended to enter. The conflict intensified as retaliation spread beyond economics. Diplomatic talks hardened, trade negotiations stalled, public rhetoric grew sharper, even as officials insisted nothing unusual was happening. Behind closed doors, however, exchange policy became a standing agenda item, discussed with the same gravity once reserved for defense planning. Money had joined the arsenal. The build-up surged when a mid-sized economy became the testing ground. Its currency was pushed rapidly downward through coordinated pressure, officially justified as market correction. In practice, the move crushed exports overnight, inflated import costs, and forced emergency austerity. The message to others was unmistakable. Compliance could be encouraged without invasion, dissent discouraged without sanctions. Citizens in the affected state felt the shock immediately. Wages lost purchasing power. Savings evaporated. Businesses closed not from mismanagement, but from ratios they could not control. Protests erupted, but there was no clear target, no army to oppose, no law to repeal, only numbers on screens that kept moving against them. Observers across Europe recognized the danger. If exchange rates could be weaponized without accountability, no economy was safe. Today's ally could become tomorrow's target. Stability depended not on fundamentals, but on alignment with those who control the levers. The system had shifted from cooperation to coercion. Inside central institutions, unease grew. Some officials warned that escalation would spiral beyond control. Markets, they argued, could tolerate adjustment, but not perpetual conflict encoded in currency. Others dismissed the concerns, believing pressure would force compliance long before collapse. But history offered little comfort. Once weapons are normalized, restraint fades. The invisible battlefield widened, pulling more states into its logic. Neutrality became harder to maintain. Silence became suspicion. Europe stood at a familiar precipice, armed not with steel or fire, but with decimals and timing. And the next move would determine whether money remained a tool of stability or became the trigger for a crisis no one could contain. The breaking point arrived not through collapse, but through fear of it. Markets began reacting not to economic data, but to intent. Traders watched statements for hidden signals. Businesses delayed investment, unsure which currency might be targeted next. Volatility fed on anticipation alone. The weapon had become too dangerous to wield casually. The climax unfolded when a coordinated adjustment misfired. What was intended as pressure triggered panic instead. Capital fled indiscriminately. Exchange mechanisms seized under the weight of uncertainty. Within hours, multiple currencies spiraled together, entangled by years of strategic manipulation. The battlefield no one could see suddenly revealed itself. Wide, unstable, and uncontrollable. Emergency meetings followed across Europe. Central banks reversed positions. Officials issued joint statements promising restraint. Quiet lines of communication reopened between rivals who now shared the same fear. That money, once turned into a weapon, no longer recognized allies. The system demanded de-escalation or collapse. The resolution took shape through reluctant agreement. New frameworks were established to limit competitive manipulation. Transparency requirements increased. Coordinated oversight replaced silent choreography. Exchange policy was pulled back from the edge, not out of idealism, but out of survival. Leaders understood that power exercised without limits eventually rebounds on its wielder. The scars remained. Trust had been damaged. Volatility lingered. But a line had been drawn. One Europe hoped it would remember. Exchange rates could influence, signal, and adjust, but they could not be allowed to coerce entire societies without consequence. The lesson endures far beyond that moment. When economic tools become weapons, everyone lives on the front line. Stability depends not just on strength, but on restraint, and on the willingness to see numbers not as ammunition, but as shared measures of value. So, what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again? The